else. So we're an employment research centre, as the name would suggest, based at the University of Strathclyde. We do a lot of work which is not directly in any way connected to health. So we do a lot of work on employability, skills and access to work. How do people get into work? How are people supported to be in work? We do a lot, probably the biggest amount of our activity has been to date on job quality, or fair work as we call it in Scotland. But the notion that good job quality is a worthy investment because it's good for our health, it's good for our well-being, it's good for business, it's good for the economy, and it's good for society. So that's the kind of work that we do, and that can do lots and lots of different things, some of which have health-related implications, for example, in the sense to which it's about designing and developing forms of work that don't lead to burnout or that improve general well-being. We do a lot of work around employment equality and regulation. So all of the work that we do is threaded through with an understanding that people in different demographic groups experience work and the workplace very differently. And we do that at a kind of from an individual level right through to a policy level when it comes to things like regulation. And then we do a lot of work around innovation and change. So we're a very applied research centre. We're very keen that what we do in research terms, we want that to be the best research that can be done, but we also want it to make a difference. So we do a lot of work on how do we create the context in which changes in work that will produce better access for people that have struggled to access work, or that will produce better job quality. How do we do that and encourage businesses and organisations to adopt that? We're pretty tiny for the amount of work that we do. That's why I've got grey hair. We're small. I like to think perfectly formed. We work a lot with external partners, but our core team are on the slide. So that's myself, Adam, and Colin Lindsay. And then we have a bundle of researchers and Chancellor's Fellows who've worked with us for some time. Specifically on work and health research, probably over the last 10 years or so, we've done quite a lot of work that has become, I think, much closer to work and health than we worked in previously. And that ranges from work that's really focused at an individual level. So how are individuals helped with health conditions or disabilities, helped to be able to access work? And improve their experience in work. So sometimes the focus of our research is very individually based, and I'll look at a couple of examples in a second. Sometimes we're looking at individuals on the basis of a particular condition. So we've done work around epilepsy and employment, and looking at the profile of employment in Scotland for people with epilepsy and some of the barriers that they face in terms of accessing and maintaining and sustaining employment. And we do some other things which are to do with other health conditions. So my colleague Jen Remnant, who was a Chancellor's Fellow, is now a senior lecturer in the centre, has done a lot of work on what she calls leaky bodies research. So she does work on incontinence, she does work on menstruation, and looks at the interaction of those experiences in workplaces. So that's a part of what we do. It's probably a reasonable third of the kind of health work that we do. The other work that we've done over time is at an occupational level. So we've done a lot of work around particular occupational groups, usually within healthcare or adjacent to healthcare in some way. And we've looked at, for example, at pharmacy workers in both hospital settings and indeed in community pharmacies. We've just finished quite a big piece of work around community pharmacy automation and the implications of that for jobs and skills and experiences within community pharmacies. And we've done a lot of work over the years in terms of social carers. So, the extent to which the experiences of being a social carer have implications for generally for your quality of work, but also in terms of your longer term health and well-being. And then we look a lot at things like specific workplace practices. So some of the stuff we do around health is related to what kinds of workplace practices might be adopted or adopted for more people, giving more people access to them, that would allow then for those people to be more able to engage in work and more able to engage in work in a healthy and well way. And then a lot of the rest of our work is around organisational level analysis and intervention. So I won't go into detail on all of these because we don't have time, but we look at specific things like how do health boards use equality and diversity metrics, how does that help them to support and retain a healthcare workforce. We've done quite a big piece of work around the operation of partnership working as a form of workplace governance in NHS Scotland, and people will know that NHS Scotland has a very developed and long-standing partnership working arrangement, which has been, I think, very helpful over the years in producing outcomes in the NHS which are positive. We've looked at the extent to which employee engagement strategies are used within healthcare workers so that healthcare workers at every level can make contributions to innovation in their own workplaces, so can problem solve, can deal with intractable challenges that they face in their day-to-day work. And we've done that through looking at employee engagement strategies. As I said, we've looked at automation, so we've looked at the adoption of robotics and what that means. And my colleague Jen Remnant is currently involved in a long-term project on long-term illness in the NHS and how that's responded to by the NHS's employers. So there's lots of different things that we do coming from an employment perspective, which is the core part of our work, which then crosses over to different aspects of health and healthcare organisation. But what I'm going to talk to you about today, on the basis that I assume that that's what Adam was going to talk to you, was intending to talk to you about, was our WISHES project. And the WISHES project that's an acronym for Workplace Intervention for Sustainable Health and Employment Support. And I'll talk to you in a little bit more detail about that project. I should say, to set out the project's a third of the way through, so it's not completed. So what we've done is to set up that, and we thought it'd be worthwhile having a conversation about what we're doing and what we hope to achieve from it. If you get a slide deck at some point, you'll see that there's all of those areas that I've just outlined have like a small slide telling you a little bit about them. I'm not going to work through all of those, just to highlight that a lot of Adam's work is around individual placement and support. So really specifically targeted interventions to support people with either physical disabilities or long-term health conditions or mental health problems to find their way in the workplace. And there's been a lot of work done. So you'll see from some of the slides that that's about working with either people with different types of conditions, or it's working with different policymakers to find forms of support that would encourage and maintain employment. And the thread that runs through all of that is that it might be good for people's health and well-being and general quality of life to be in employment rather than to be excluded from employment. And that's an increasingly important part of our work. So that's there are lots of different examples of that. Sometimes we're working with partners to look at things like how does policy support or funding deliver the right kind of outcomes for people with disabilities. We've talked a little bit about that. And all of these will be on the slide pack, but I'm really not going to run through them all because that would be incredibly dull for you. But they will be there, and I'm going to quickly move on and talk, eventually get to the point about WISHES. So there's some, as I say, there's some little bits and pieces, and there's some links if anybody wishes to follow up on any of those projects or ask a question about those later on. So the WISHES project is a National Institute of Health research project, which we started about a year ago. We had, led by Adam, we had a pilot project prior to that, which was to put together a consortium, which became the broader, it was called WORK, but it became the WISHES, the WISHES project. And basically the starting point of the WISHES project is that people with disabilities and long-term health conditions face significant labour market exclusion and other associated disadvantages. So it's not just that they're excluded from getting jobs. When they're in jobs, those jobs tend to be of poorer quality. So that was the starting problem of the WISHES research. We know that people with disabilities in the UK have a much more substantial employment gap than actually exists in many other advanced welfare states. So that's not clearly just about disability, that's about policy and support in relation to disability. We know that people with disabilities and long-term health conditions are twice as likely as their non-disabled or non-ill counterparts to exit the labour market. So there's some really quite big exclusion issues there. And we know that if you look across most job quality indicators, you'll find that people with disabilities experience, for some of them, a poorer set of experiences than people without disabilities. And that's harmful in all sorts of obvious ways, which I'm sure everybody in the room knows about. It's harmful to the health and the quality of life of the person with disabilities themselves. It contributes to wider socioeconomic inequalities, which is problematic from a societal point of view. It is a significant and an increasingly growing cost for the state, and it's a growing cost also for employers. And it actually just represents a massive waste of talent, which is, which is problematic at all sorts of levels, but has implications for the wider economy of the UK. So it's a problem for that reason too, not just for individuals. A lot of the work on how do you tackle the issues of exclusion and disadvantage facing people with disabilities is very supply side focused. So it is about supporting the person, fixing the person, putting the person with the disability in a position where they are maybe encouraged or supported or in some way fixed to be more resilient, more capable of engaging with the contemporary labour market. And that's really problematic, I think. I'm not suggesting that supply side interventions are not in many cases important and helpful, but they're not enough, because actually people with disabilities have to be able to function in a demand space, so the space where other people work. And our approach has been to suggest that rather than focus on fixing the person, it would be much better, and this is consistent with our wider work, if we were able to fix the workplace in some way. We were able to create jobs and workplaces which were more accessible for people with disabilities and health conditions, and in which they were able to be more successful as well as just to access those work. And that's theoretically very consistent with work on the social model of disability, which suggests that disability doesn't just stem from an individual in isolation, but it stems from their interaction with wider workplace conditions. So that's a good reason for focusing on fixing the workplace. But it's also, our approach is, I think, also supported by very practical evidence that better workplace conditions, as well as being good for our health in general, also help the work and employment outcomes of people with disabilities. So behind that is obviously the view that people with disabilities and sometimes with other personal contextual circumstances, such as caring responsibilities or faith-based requirements, might need changes in what work looks like from the norm. So they might need changes either to the timing of work, the tasks that they do, the environments in which they work, where they're located. So we know that that's a good thing for people to be able to have a job that better matches what their personal stroke contextual requirements are. And so in workplaces where employers are good at making adjustments, that's often helpful for people with disabilities, or where jobs are highly autonomous, or where you can work in different environments where you can make changes for yourself. And lots of us on this call will have those jobs. We won't have jobs where we have to ask somebody whether we can do something at a different time, or whether we can do it in a different place, or we can manage it in a different way. So lots of higher level jobs do have the kind of autonomy and flexibility to be able to adjust a job to suit your own personal circumstances. But more widely, inclusive working conditions are not widespread. I think everybody thinks that now we have had the COVID pandemic and remote working, for example, rose, that actually everybody can now access remote working. And clearly that's not true. Very small proportions of jobs are available for remote working. We know that, as I said earlier, in terms of job quality indicators, disabled workers have below average work autonomy, less likely to have access to remote working. We know that disabled workers can sometimes get adjustments if they disclose their disabilities, but sometimes they don't want to disclose them, or they only disclose them when things have become extreme. And actually, we also know from the evidence that quite a lot of workers who disclose their disability in order to secure a reasonable adjustment don't get them for a host of quite different reasons. There's some evidence that managers choose between workers who they think are deserving in terms of disability adjustments. But some of our own early research in the wider literature suggests that actually a lot of managers who might be keen to be disability conscious are also very nervous about what seems to be perks for people with disabilities who can access different arrangements and conditions than other parts of the workforce. So the very simple argument behind Wishes is, what should we do about that? We've proposed a universal job crafting intervention, which means that you're trying to encourage organisations to adopt ways of working that would be more inclusive, that would be more responsive, that would allow workers themselves to be able to make changes to their work and workplace in ways that should provide a benefit for disabled workers, but which might also provide a benefit for workers whose connection to work and ability to deliver work are also affected by their own personal circumstances. So as I say, that might be workers with caring responsibilities. And again, there's quite good support in the literature for the view that actually disabled people do better in work environments where everybody has some flexibility to be able to change. And so that's a good starting point. And we think that a universal intervention of a job crafting type might help address the disability employment gap and tackle other work-related inequalities. Just for a second on what we mean by job crafting, it may or may not be a term that you've encountered before. It basically refers to the kind of changes that you can make from the bottom up in your work and workplace that make it better for you. It's that straightforward. So it might make your work more productive, it might make it more sustainable, it might make it more enjoyable, it might make it more easy to balance with your personal or family life. And so job crafting isn't where you go and ask your manager if you can have an arrangement that makes that work-life interface more straightforward. It is about being able, in the context of your job on an ongoing basis, to make changes that make it work better for you. There's quite a big literature on job crafting. It's got a reasonably small, short history, but there's a fairly extensive literature about its benefits. Although very little of that relates to workers with disability. A lot of the research is focused on job crafting as a form of avoiding burnout and improving things like retention. So that literature doesn't really speak much to disabled workers. And there is some relatively promising evidence that it works, that if you allow people to make positive changes to their own workplace, that they are likely to stay, be retained in that organisation, that they are less likely to have sickness absence, they are less likely to burn out at work, and their general reported well-being is higher. So the beginning of a promising evidence base, but it's dominated by relatively small-scale interventions, not a lot of follow-up, focus on a very specific number of outcomes. Doesn't really look a lot at employment outcomes over the longer term. It's not really tested against counterfactuals in any way, and it's often looked at as a sort of work team type experiment rather than connected to wider workplace or organisational factors. And there's not a lot of evidence as to how you make it work in the different types of workplaces in which it might be deployed. So Wishes is all about, can job crafting boost employment and health for disabled workers in the UK? And we hope at the end of it to be able to answer that question. So what we're doing in the project is we'd like to demonstrate whether or not it's viable to have a low-cost, evidence-based, scalable job crafting intervention that would help disabled workers, but will also, what in our trial is available to non-disabled workers. And we want to be able not to understand just whether that is helpful to workers themselves, but whether it is a cost benefit, effective means for employers to try and support people with a variety of health conditions and other workplace support needs. And then once we've done that, if that turns out to be the case, what we want to do is to deliver a set of evidence-based knowledge exchange materials and resources so that we can encourage at no cost for employers to engage with job crafting to support their disabled workforces. So We've got three research questions. It's fairly straightforward. How does an evidence-based job crafting intervention impact on the behaviours and the work and health outcomes for workers with not just with disabilities, but including those with disabilities and health conditions and those that have other aligned workplace support needs? What's that cost? What does it save? And what are the things that happen in workplaces on a day-to-day basis that either enable that to happen successfully or stand in the way of that happening successfully? And what kinds of solutions or insights might we have about those enablers and barriers? The project necessarily is based on co-production, so PPIE has been absolutely central to the project from its inception, from the very start of the NIHR development project. We've worked with partners from the disability community, and those partners have been inextricably engaged in the ways of working and the plans that we've had for the project. And that's been quite interesting for team members who've not worked in this way before. So as well as having research team members themselves who have disabilities and have a range of work experiences arising from that, we have a co-production leadership team, which is a lived experience group, a disabled people's organisations group, and a series of policy and practice representatives. So that, for example, would be people from the employer community and also from the policy community, because the policy community quite often designs the type of policy supports that exist in helping people with disabilities to access work. And disabled people and their organisations have been completely involved in every stage of the project to date. They're involved in how we discuss what the objectives of the project will be, and how we talk about how we will access people, what sort of materials we will use. Accessibility is obviously a really big part of that. So all of our materials are designed with accessibility checks and standards at the forefront. Everything is available in accessible versions. We support through quite a big budget, an accessibility budget. We have staff who support that accessibility, and we also support people to participate in this project, whether that's disabled people's organisations who are funded through the project, or disabled people themselves who will take part in the project, who will be compensated for being research participants. I think that's really, really important. This is not, for the most part, a piece of research that requires us to engage with the NHS ethics process, except if we are working with an NHS case organisation, so that's slightly different. But we're an experienced team of dealing with ethical issues for vulnerable respondents. We've got a multi-pronged approach to ensuring that we have consent right throughout the process, and to making sure that any harms that we identify are properly mitigated. And that might be not just for the respondents themselves, but that might actually be, given the nature of the subject, it might be the experience of the research team. We don't think that we're focusing on specifically on people's disability in a really in-depth way, but we're focusing on how that impacts on their workplace. But we do understand that that may be particularly challenging for some people. The project has 3 work packages. So we've got an RCT, which is our intervention work package. We have, and I'll talk about that in a second, we've got an evaluation work package, which is impact evaluation of the RCT and broader cost-benefit analysis. And then we've got a knowledge exchange work package about how we develop tools and resources arising from the project findings. So basically, in terms of the intervention RCT, which is a bit odd, it's not really a work and employment thing to do, so it's been interesting for our team to have to engage with that. Interesting being a euphemistic word. It's been challenging in lots of different ways, but what we're trying to do is to have 2 types of intervention in 40 different organisations across different sizes and sectors. And we are looking to achieve a participant sample size of 300 in each of the treatment arms. So the 2 treatment arms are really, it's not possible to have a complete neutral control in a workplace because people talk to other people. And unless you prohibit them from doing that, which would be a challenge, they can't they can't do that. So what we have is this. What we have is this intensive job crafting group where people will be supported through workshops to create a personal crafting intervention plan, and therefore to put that into practice, and then those people will be followed up. So that's the intensive treatment arm. And the control group has got what we've called a light touch intervention. So we're basically giving some information through a leaflet about what are the key considerations if you wanted to engage in job crafting for people who might be interested in it and might want to pick it up in their own work teams or in their own work process, but are not part of the direct interaction in a workshop sense or a training sense with the research team, although we will follow up with that control group in terms of what they've done with that material. And the argument there is that if it turns out that job crafting is a good way of improving the experiences of people with disabilities in employment, then we would want to know whether that could be done either by a bundle of researchers hanging around your workplace for months on end, or can it be done in a different way through things like documentary support. We collect all sorts of data. I'm going to stop in a second, but just I'll quickly run through the last couple of slides. We can collect personal, demographic and household information. We collect a lot of information on household employment characteristics, and whether you can contract secure, what kind of hours do you have, where can you work. Things like benefits and your engagement with the welfare system and travel to work. Specific information on the extent to which disability or health life circumstances impact on your life and your working life. We ask people about whether or not they have disclosed their support needs at work and what that disclosure has resulted in, what kind of experiences they've had from that. And we look a lot at the work characteristics that they have. So it may well be that there are people who have quite a lot of autonomy who are already, not using the term because it's not that common, who are already job crafting in relation to their disabilities, but have not thought about it in that way. So we're trying to pick up that at the beginning and at various points throughout the process, and more broadly looking at the extent to which life spills over into work and work spills over into life, with a particular focus on health conditions. We're also looking from an organisational point of view. So that's very much focused on the trial participants, but from an organisational point of view, we're really interested in to what extent does the workplace context or the way in which implementation takes place make a difference between whether a job crafting intervention is effective or not effective, whether or not it can be sustained or otherwise. And so we'll collect quite a lot of qualitative process data to link that organisational context with the intervention, the process and the outcomes, using things like policy documentary analysis, a range of semi-structured interviews and focus groups. And that's going to take place not in all of the 40 organisations, because that would be just about impossible, but it will take place in 9 purposefully selected case study organisations, where we'll have a series of scoping interviews with lead stakeholders, interviews with trial participants, focus groups with other people who are adjacent to job crafting and disability support, like human resource leads or equality and diversity leads, and indeed, crucially, the line managers who are an important gatekeeper as to whether or not people with disabilities can, independently of asking for an adjustment, change their working practices, because that usually requires some kind of line manager support, formally or informally. And we'll collect some data around the cost of the trial itself. We're looking at a series of different types of outcome measures. So the primary outcome measure is this workability index, which captures someone's ability to perform their job in relation to its demands and their own mental health and mental resources. We look at a number of different measures of employment outcomes. We look at a number of different health outcomes, and then we look at some intermediate outcomes, which are about the intervention process and the engagement which it might encourage for people to then produce the other primary outcome measure. What do we think it's all going to add up to? We hope lots. So this is the biggest job crafting trial in the world, given its scale. And so we hope that, given the way in which we've gone about it, we will have something scholarly to say to the academic community in terms of not only job crafting itself, but also workplace disability inclusion. But actually what this project is about, and what is absolutely key across the research team, is it's about the extent to which we can maximise societal impact. So can we find a way of supporting employers to create the conditions in which people with disabilities are not as disadvantaged in the workplace if they can access the workplace in the first place, not as disadvantaged once they get there, and are more likely to stay there with all of the benefits which come from that. And that will be about us engaging very widely with the employer community in the UK to try and support people who are inclined to be able to create those sorts of circumstances and outcomes. And I think